everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, we are delighted to have the wonderful Shu Yap back on the channel. So thank you so much, Shu, for joining us again today. And how are you doing this morning in Australia?
I'm good, thank you. It's so good to be here. I always love having a chat with you, Callum.
Wonderful, likewise. Well, it's nearly my bedtime here, so I've had a couple of cups of tea, so forgive me if I'm not completely with it.
Oh, at least you have an excuse.
That's right. Wonderful. So our topic of discussion today is going to be on one of my favorite techniques, which is solar returns. And I'm sure the majority of our audience are familiar with solar returns, but for those who aren't, can you explain what solar returns are and the effectiveness of solar returns as a forecasting tool?
Sure. Solar returns is the chart of the year, essentially, and we create that chart based on the sun moving back to its exact position as it was when you were born. And that chart would encapsulate your whole entire year in a chart. So it's a pretty neat system. It sounds very simple, and it can be, but it can also be ripped apart and dissected, and we can get a lot of complex calculations and dynamics through it as well. So it depends how much time you have and what purpose you use the solar return chart for as to which techniques you apply to view it.
Eloquent, fantastic explanation. Again, one of my favorite techniques, and I think we're actually going to go for a few chart examples.
I've got an example for Marilyn Monroe, and I chose this only because I know she's got an accurate time of birth, and also because it was Neptune is stationing. So, and I see Marilyn as such a Neptunian figure, as you'll see when we look at her birth chart. So I'm sure all of you know Marilyn Monroe, but if you don't, she is an actress, a model, an entertainer, and not just for her pretty looks. She was actually very committed to her acting. She, as successful as she was, she had a very difficult childhood. Well, firstly, being an illegitimate child of that era was brought in a whole range of issues. The big trauma in her life was that her father never wanted anything to do with her, or her mother for that matter. And you can see she's Leo rising. So that's a very deep cut that for any Leo rising to have is to not have that strong relationship with the father. And so her mother loved her very much, and her early childhood was quite happy. However, being a single mother, living in poverty, her mother's inability to cope then led to nervous breakdown, then an eventual diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. And so, after the age of 5 onwards, that started to her happy childhood started to wane. And then we'll look at when she was 8 years old in our example today, because that's when things started to really deteriorate for Marilyn's childhood. She was in and out of foster homes. She eventually became a ward of the state. So, and very traumatic childhood. And as her biographies suggest, these painful memories that she has or that she had, she was never able to really leave behind. And that may have been one of the attractions for being such a good actress, because really what she was doing was numbing herself and trying to escape the reality of her life.
And that's very Neptunian, the illusion or the escapism, and so glamorous, and still a wonderful figure to this day that so many people are still obsessed about, and again, such a glamorous figure. But as you say, that Neptunian, it's that mask or that thing, burying some of those issues she's had growing up through her life, as you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. It's really quite sad, isn't it? And you can see that Neptune is right in the first house there. So obviously with anything at the angles, especially the ascendant, that planet's going to feature very prominently in the life in some way. So it did bring her some great skills and talents too, and this elusiveness and demure, very attractive je ne sais quoi, about her. I think she said she lost one of her earlier modeling jobs because she had too much sex appeal. That was the feedback. Wow. So it was both good and bad, that Neptune. So, but we're going to head into a chart of her 8th year. And now just a bit of a trigger warning. This was, a particularly difficult year for her, out of many difficult years as for any child to have to go through. So the trigger warning is, I guess, based around her experiences and being physically in care. So we won't go into too much details of it, but in 1934, before her birthday, which was in June, her mother was hospitalized again, this time more seriously, because she was actually officially diagnosed now with paranoid schizophrenia. Previous hospitalizations, they were mainly for rest because, she was overworked and stressed and trying to raise a child with no money and having to go to work and raise a child. So this, just before her solar return in 1934, this was one of the serious hospitalizations that really saw Marilyn engaged in foster homes more permanently. So in this year, she was in a foster home, which was like a boarding house, I think. So many people lived there and boarded there. And she had an experience where one of the older boarders, who was considered to be one of the star boarder of the house, everyone loved him, he was a great man, but he in fact sexually abused her. And when she told her foster mother, she was only met with disbelief. She actually got hit across the mouth and said, don't say anything, how dare you say such horrible things about such a nice man. So as you can imagine how horrific that situation was. But at the same time as well, in that year, her mother also came out of hospital and was able to purchase a house through a housing loan. And they lived with another acting couple. They were vaudeville actors. And so and she also talked about that as, a happy time. So we can see a bit of a mix in situations here, and this will be reflected in her solar return chart, because through this living arrangement with this other set of vaudeville actors, she was able to learn skills in juggling and hula hooping, and they also helped her with her speech as well. And her mother also bought her a piano. So she had other joys happening within the same year, and we can see that in the solar return chart. So let's move along to the next slide. Yeah. And firstly, one of the things that we look at importantly in the solar return chart is the ascendant. Okay, that really tells you a great deal about one's approach and outlook for the life, one's temperament, one's themes that they're about to head into. So being in the sign of Cancer, we know Cancer is a cardinal water sign. It's both cold and moist, so it brings up the melancholic temperament. And that cold and moistness of a sign or any temperament shows this being in one's own thoughts or withdrawing down and being withdrawing in, that's that kind of cold and moistness. If you think of water, it always sinks down to its lowest possible course it can get to, and it's dense and thick in nature. So that kind of gives you a bit of a feel of what Marilyn's nature was for that year. Now, the ruler of the ascendant is the moon. And so the moon wants to connect. It wants to have a sense of belonging. However, this is confirmed by being in the 7th house. She is somewhat wanting to be with other people. But if we look at the moon being in Saturn's sign, Saturn is very much the opposite of that. It's all about being on one's own, having a separative quality. So this moon really isn't able to connect. Then we dig into the essential dignities of the moon. We see that the moon is peregrine, a condition that we call peregrine, which shows that it it feels like it's wandering. It's like a foreigner in a foreign place with nowhere to go, with no one that they know. So this moon is very much not a happy moon. And on top of that, it can't see its own sign. It can't see Cancer. So it can't support its own affairs. So, if we look at this Cancer being a sign that rules the tribe or a sense of belonging, what does the moon actually tell us about her ability to do that? Well, it tells us that, she may be feeling disconnected, unnurtured, not supported, feeling like an outsider, not having anyone to turn to. We definitely saw this to be the case when firstly her mother is taken away from her, so that as an 8-year-old child, that is your support system.
Highly traumatic.
Very traumatic. And not only that, her foster mother, who she turned to in her time of need, basically saw her, exiled her situation, exiled her story. She was very much on her own, but nevertheless, being in a codependent space, the moon in the 7th house. So very, very difficult year for her.
And as you were saying before, it's compounded natally. I mean, that moon natal, I mean, it's with angularity, it's got strength, but natal, we have issues with that moon. We have that mutually applying square with Saturn. I mean, we can probably, I don't know if you're bringing the whole T-square with Neptune, Saturn, and the moon as well, but talking about a natal promise along with a solar return for that particular year.
Yes, totally. Yes. And we'll go into, I've got a slide coming up next with the solar return and the natal chart side by side, so you can view that. But the other thing that we always, if we're glancing at the solar return chart, we want to see what's on the angles, because those angular planets are going to rise to prominence over any other planet in that chart for the year. So as you can see, the most obvious one there is Pluto in the 1st house, okay? 1st house being the self, the physical body. So Pluto being a planet of loss and abandonment, abuse, power, control. So she's certainly, the matters that arose for her this year to prominence was this of the self, of the physical body. Okay?
And that's really quite tight. Is that 22, 20, within a degree on
yes,
that Pluto? Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and you raise a really great point, Callum, in terms of the orb. I'm not sure what orb you use, but from a traditional sense, that 3-degree orb is that point of engagement. Anything above the 3-degree is more about witnessing a planet and being a test, having testimony to that planet. But when it gets to that 3-degree orb, we're now in that engagement zone where we're battling with that planet.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, natally, you can be maybe more liberal with the orbs if we're talking about the lights or whatever it might be, but getting to movement techniques, really trying to tighten those orbs as much as possible. So I totally agree. Absolutely.
Yep. And so, yeah, that's the other good point too. Like when looking at a solar return chart, it is in a way reading, and we're using the same principles as a natal chart. But I think the execution of those techniques, and certainly the communication of those techniques, differs when you're talking about a solar return chart. And that comes in more importantly, especially when you get to do client work as well. Because as we were having a discussion off air before, Callum, sometimes you see things in a chart and your mind immediately goes to think, this is how it works out. But the chart during the year will play out in a different way that you didn't expect, but nevertheless, the archetypal essence is the same. So it comes to a matter of really honing down your communication, which is an important and an ethical consideration when you're talking about prediction.
Certainly, and certainly the emphasis on ethical, because we have to go through many ethical considerations when we're dealing with clients, and especially if we're talking about sensitive issues. Absolutely.
So let's look at other angular planets in this solar return chart. We have here the moon that we discuss. So the moon, being that planet of belonging, of connection, those are themes that are going to be prominent and brought to question in this year. And then, you look at the condition of the moon. Is it in, what kind of condition is it in? Because that will then determine how that moon story is going to be played out that year in prominence to that life. Okay. Then we also see Jupiter and Venus on the angles too. And here is this other side of that year that she spoke about, that, it also contained the two, she actually, because I do have one of her biographies, she talks about she has two memories from childhood and good memories. And these are the memories she'll cherish forever. And it happened to also be in this year. So here we see an extreme of circumstances, something really bad happen, but also great things happen. And you can use Pluto on the ascendant there as a testimony to that. Pluto brings extremes, and not extremes in any one way, but in both ways. And this is where we have to park our own biases aside and step into that consultation space, or that reading the chart space with as much neutrality as possible. So there we see maybe, Jupiter in the fourth, although retrograde, her mother's ability to buy a home. Although that retrograde condition of Jupiter shows that maybe that home is not going to be long lasting. Something is changing. What's given is going to be taken away, as we understand with the whole reversal concept of Jupiter. And then we have that Venus Uranus in the 10th house there, bringing. Say again.
Sorry, quite prominent up here.
Prominent, exactly. And notice as well where this is her Venus return year. And that's another thing that we look at in the course, like the planetary returns as seen in the solar return chart. So when we see planetary returns in a solar return chart, it basically should spark something in your head saying something about that story of that planet making its return is making a huge evolution in its lifetime journey, as in the native's lifetime journey. I did a workshop on that, the Venus cycles, where we spoke about that last year. But we see Venus, I think that might have something to do with living with those two actors, and that being a very inspiring and gift-giving kind of situation for her, because she was able to learn new skills and maybe value herself as for her talents. But also it was quite unconventional. That's indicated by Neptune being in its detriment, but as well as being conjunct Uranus. That I'm not sure if vaudeville actors were commonplace back in that era, but it wasn't a normal sort of screen kind of actor kind of situation. They were doing things like burlesque and hula hooping and juggling, more unusual kinds of talents that may not have been conventional. So we see that in Venus being in exile and conjunct Uranus there. So some of these big themes that, just by glancing, we haven't even gone that deeply into the chart yet, we can glean this sort of information. And on top of that, maybe that Venus Uranus also suggested a shock, the shock of the sexual abuse, being Venus being connected to sex.
Really, partile, with it, partile, conjunction, that we're talking really up there. I find that Mars-Venus mutual reception, I don't know if there's any, gleaning information to take from that as well, but so prominent. It's something that, when you look at a chart, certain things just pop to you and you go,
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and both Mars and Venus, both being in their sign of exile, both not seeing eye to eye because they can't witness each other. So there's something going on there, something not supportive, something that's not resourceful to herself, but something you can see hidden from sight, with that whole aversion there. So let's move on to the next chart, the next slide, where we'll bring up both the ascendant and the solar return and the natal chart side by side. So if you could proceed on to.
Am I on the next page? No, do I need to go over again?
Oh, sorry, I'm not looking at yours. Yes, that's the one.
That's the one. Perfect. I'm going to try and move this video out of the way. There we go. Maybe in the middle.
Okay.
Sorry.
So here on the chart on the left, we have the solar return chart that we just saw. Then on the chart on the right, we have the Marilyn's natal chart. So what we want to do is turn our attention to which house is the solar return ascendant waking up from the natal chart. So the solar return ascendant is in the sign of Cancer. In the natal chart, that in fact is the natal 12th house that rules our sorrows, our losses, sadness, depression, secrets, secret enemies. So as we've heard, that's very relevant for her that year. Mm-hmm. That 12th house becomes a temporary ascendant for Marilyn for that year. Mm. So we're looking at the life now through the lens of the 12th house. So the lens of the endings of maybe one part of her life, and maybe trying to she's basically at a stage of endings, basically. That's also confirmed by Venus making one whole cycle, one whole 8-year synodic cycle as well. So there's all these different levels that are confirming that kind of year for her. And natally, because she's only 8 years old, Pluto hasn't moved too far from its natal position, but we're also waking up that Pluto in the 12th natally. So if we saw Pluto in the 12th house natally, you would imagine that the story of that Pluto is one that lies hidden in the subconscious, not something that's going to be flourishing in the external life. But for this particular year, Pluto does. Pluto, all these subconscious, platonic, cathartic situations that may have been going on in her head. Maybe she might have been witnessing, her mother having relationships with other people, or her mother going into episodes of despair and depression with her undiagnosed schizophrenia up until that stage. Or she's a child. Any child is a sponge to their environment, but it kind of stays within our subconscious for a very long time. But when by solar return it happens to move across an angle, you can bet any money that those hidden things natally are going to be rising to prominence. So here we see sadness, sorrows coming up, and through the topics of abuse, control, power, and dominance. Okay. Now, if we move to the next slide, we can also see, and this is another topic that we bring up in the solar return course. I'm just rushing through these, that we also bring in the topic of annual profections and looking at them through the lens of the solar return chart. Now, this is based on my study of Ben Dyke's translation of Abu Mashar, where it goes into a lot of detail around integrating annual perfections and solar returns. And it's not the easiest book to read, I must say. And I must say I've spent many hours with my eyeballs hanging out of my head, having to upgrade my prescriptions for my glasses in the dark. So hopefully I've summarized and encapsulated the core essence and techniques of integrating these two techniques into this course for you, so that you don't have to necessarily do what I've done. But so one of the things that we look at is that in her 8th year, that is Marilyn's 9th house perfection. So what we're seeing here is that the the big life themes for her is around her beliefs, her values, her principles and meaning in life. These are important themes for her. And we also...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you still seeing the charts, or do you see this 5-week solar return course? Which chart, which slide do you see?
There should be a slide before that, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I've gone way ahead.
Okay. That's okay.
Annual Perfections, ninth. Can you see that one?
Let me just pull that up. Yes, that looks like the one.
Okay, sorry. I think I was...
Yes.
I need more cups of tea. There we go.
No problems at all. So, you think, well, what is a ninth house matter for a child? We've always got to come back to the client, because a ninth house will mean something very different to you and I compared to a ninth house matter for an 8-year-old child. Okay. So, what does this mean for Marilyn and in her 8th year? So this would indicate something about her worldview in her 8-year-old way. So her worldview would have been, for an 8-year-old child, based around parents or maybe friends and her support system. That is her world, her toys, her belongings. That is what an 8-year-old child would view the world through. Maybe more emotionally, one's ability to feel safe, one's ability to be connected and secure and to be loved, that is what would be tied into her meaning in life. Okay. So coming back to seeing how this ninth house of worldview is playing out in the solar return, well, Mars rules that ninth house natally. It's in that 8th house. So natally, we can see this is a life where one's meaning is going to be very difficult to obtain in one's life. Mars is in an adjacent sign, inversion. It has term and face rulership, the minor dignities. Nevertheless, it has some level of resources that she may be able to get some meaning in life eventually. However, does it really feed into her sense of understanding of the world? Probably not. And Mars is very debilitated being in that 8th house, the 8th house being a sign that can't see the life of the ascendant. So it doesn't support the life. In fact, it is acting from a place of decay, destruction, and death. So not a great condition there. So when we come to the solar return chart on the left, we're really only being able to, Mars is really only going to be able to enact what we see natally. That is the benchmark. It can't be too much greater than the benchmark, if you know what I mean. So, Mars in the 11th, one would say that this might be a year where hopes and dreams are being worked on here, okay? That there's some aspirational quality to that year, as well as being in one's being in touch with maybe new networks of friendships and people that might help to bring one's aspirations to life, okay, one's future to life. But looking at Mars in the solar return chart, we can see it is in detriment in the sign of Taurus, okay? So that's
a good point when you're talking about dignities and abilities. So as you pointed out here, we see Mars, the outer set malefic, in detriment. How important is evaluating planetary strength when you're putting all these techniques together?
Very important. That's a really good point. So like even looking at essential dignities, in her natal chart, Mars has minor dignities, but nevertheless still dignities. Mars is in its own term and it's in its own face. But in the solar return, Mars is in detriment. So it's really taking a step backwards, that Mars. So the condition of Mars, well, it's still powerful. Mars being in detriment, under the Lilly system, he still gave it 5 points, but he gave it -5 points.
Yeah.
So that means power going the wrong way. So power going the wrong way could look like power given away to someone in her community, Mars in the 11th, or power having to be gained by going through alternative ways. Okay, so not the sort of access to power that you would conventionally use. So maybe this might be the situation of her having to go through other people to access her power. So those vaudeville actors that she was living with temporarily for that year gave her some sense of power and meaning in life, learning the piano, learning juggling, learning dictation, her diction, working on that. Also, Mars in the 11th in detriment is, that power given away to that person that abused her in her living community. So it can go both ways, but nevertheless, it's a powerful placement. So yeah, so a perfected Lord of the Year will have a very important story to tell in that solar return year. So what it's saying in this particular case, that matters of destruction, decay, around one's meaning in life is going to be enacted through the community, and is going to be, because it's in the 11th house in the solar return, and it's going to be raising some issues or questions around one's future. So I would imagine that, knowing Marilyn's later life and all of her her relationships and feelings of worthiness with men and things like that, that this was maybe one of the significant years where these principles of self-esteem and power to do, given away to men, and that dependency and codependency and relationship to be able to have one's own self-esteem, and that being the whole meaning of her life. We can see how that was formative in that 8-year-old Marilyn by looking at this solar return. So
it's amazing. And I didn't know any of this from Marilyn Monroe. So to delineate and glean this information, like I say, such a powerful impact on a young child that, can energy can push through for the rest of their life. So that's it's really it's sad, but it's very fascinating at the same time.
Yeah, and we were speaking off air as well around the importance and the privilege of us as we have as astrologers, of having this information. Like we don't know what's going to be happening in the future, really. Because the future based on symbols, they are the symbols, but symbols will need context and life energy to bring them, to animate them into being. Okay, symbols are showing us an archetypal multivalence of a spectrum of a type of situation, but we still need the life to be the stage from which this symbol is animated. So as astrologers, we don't really know what's going to happen in the future. We can make assumptions, but they are just assumptions. But having the solar return chart and at least knowing that, what we do know is that we know what we are in the present life, in the present moment, and having the consciousness of the present moment as well as having the symbols of the future laid in front of us now, is such a privileged position to be in, that we can not only assume, that's one thing we can do, but we can plan. We can plan, as say, if this was our child, knowing that this child was about to have this solar return year, what can we do about it as parents to support that child to head into a time of life where she will be undergoing processes of decay and destruction and endings, and building meaning into her life. Like we can support her by showing her what types of things life could mean for us, because of that 9th house perfection. So
that's such an eloquent explanation. And again, I think Stephen Forrest coins the term the fields of possibilities, or the potential. I mean, you've got your natal potential. We put all these techniques, movement techniques together, but as you say, we can't know for definite what's coming on. But if we see things or repeating symbols for repeating themes or patterns, as you said, it's that preparation for maybe certain areas of life or certain themes that might come up to help us or to help others prepare for what might come ahead. So I think that's just a beautiful way of explaining it.
Yeah, thank you. And so, yeah, this is essentially what this course I'm trying to get across in this course is by teaching some techniques, and there are lots of different ways to look at the solar return chart. So I will be going through lots of different ways, but you don't have to look at all the different ways. And it's probably a good time to go to that blue slide here, because that kind of shows the key topics that I'll be covering in this course. You don't need to look at all of these techniques, and these techniques will also be determined by how much time you have as well. And also, when during the year are you reading this chart? Are you reading this chart before the solar return year, or are you reading this chart, say, for a client that's coming to you midway through the year for an update? Because there's different lenses to use at different applications. So, we've covered some of the basic interpretive principles today, although we will go into a lot more detail in the course, where, there's a lot of flipping back and forth between the natal chart and the solar returns chart. We'll also bring in the annual profections as well, because we're looking at now the different types of time. Looking at symbolic time versus real time and what that means for the individual. And also we'll be learning how to track the solar return chart over multiple years and looking at some patterns that we get when we have a wider lens. And then also we'll be tracking some ways to track the actual solar return chart during the year, whether it is through transits, whether it is through monthly profections, etc. So it will cover a lot, and certainly just an introduction. However, I think it will be a solid foundation for you to be then applying these techniques for your own practice.
Fantastic. And again, the link to the registration is going to be below this video, and we're going to have pop-ups as we go through. It also brings up another important question, because there are many schools of thought about how to use the solar return. Now, some might use it with the location they're at. What are your thoughts of people just using their particular location? Because, for example, I'm from England. I live on the East Coast of the United States. So looking at the location rather than the natal, why is the natal so important in the context of solar returns and perfection, etc. For you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, everyone has differing opinions on this. So I'm just essentially showing you sharing my opinion. My opinion is that we always use the natal time, because it needs to be rooted in the life, the life that our soul that incarnated at that specific precise time. Out of all these combinations of times, we chose that particular time to incarnate in, and that has a significance there. And so we always, whether we look at solar return charts, horary charts, electional charts, it needs to be rooted back into the natal, because you're the life that will animate these symbols. And so this then brings in the topic of fate versus free will, because we are fated to a degree in our lives, and I think that's symbolic of using the natal time. It's acknowledging that my life is fated to a degree. I think that there was a plan. There's this greater order that we are that goes beyond our consciousness. But I think when we try and look at solar return charts from locations, what we're doing is that we're playing with fate. We're enforcing our free will, and that's okay. But I would suggest, and in Lee Lehman's book, she talks about this, is like, well, free will is actually really bloody hard to do. Like, even the most conscious monks that meditate all day and that have no influences of any emotion or any person empathetically, even they couldn't be so conscious about every single movement of a planet to be able to enforce our free will. So by default, as much as we think we are agents of free will, we will naturally gravitate to the lazy being of ourselves, because I certainly can't do it. It's hard work trying to be free will orientated.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to share a quick, I know I'm not going over time,
Yes.
but share my quick examples of solar returns I had last year and this year coming up, because it gets to that point of fate versus free will. Because, for a time I was in the camp of, okay, you can change everything that's going on. You've got, near complete free will, all those kind of things. But the more I study and the more I use these techniques, I'm like, maybe you can color in the lines or there's certain aspects, but there must be some overarching themes that seem to happen. And again, I'll do it as I'm looking at some of these examples. This is a quick bare bones example of my solar return from last year, which was February of 2021 to 2022. And this is for context, this is my final year at Kepler College. So I literally, all I did was stay like a hermit indoors and write article after, assignments after assignments. And it was just completely hermit time, calculating charts by hand. And it was also 11th house perfected year. So it was leading towards my ambitions of getting my professional diploma at Kepler. So when I pulled up this one last year, just for a glance, my eyes were drawn to the third house stellium of the solar return, and it's so packed in there. So I was like, well, third house themes are going to happen. And to compound this matter, my natal third house is Sagittarius. So what was coming up for that year was my third house of the solar return ascendant. Now, again, to compound that, the ruler of the solar return ascendant is in the third house of the solar return ascendant conjunct the Lord of the year. Everything was third house that year. I didn't leave the house. It was just writing after writing after writing after one thing after another. So
but also what's really interesting with that stellium there, if we refer to the synodic solar phase cycle webinar that we just did, you have all these planets that have just started their new cycles. So on the morning side will be Venus, Pluto, Venus, Jupiter. And so they're all enthusiastic, new, young planets full of enthusiasm and energy. And then Mercury there is about to shift into a new cycle too. So you can see that there's change. There's like a new beginning that started, but also one that's about to come.
I love that. And again, I love how you add the nuance, because that's what you'll be doing in your course is, again, not just looking at the bare bones solar returns and putting all the techniques together, but adding that nuance and digging even deeper into the course, which is fascinating. And I'll just, for the very last example, this is my solar return bare bones for this year. But again, the preponderance of planets from the northern and southern hemisphere. So for this year, I have the Lord of the Year, Mercury, and I think we talked about that before we came on air. And, conjunct the solar return, midheaven in the 9th. We've got the ruler of the solar return, Venus, conjunct, together like they were, but they flipped on that third 9th house axis. So I looked at it last year and I thought, I wonder if I'll be doing something with Kepler College. And lo and behold, they asked me, they said, hey, do you want to, would you like to assist teaching in our W101 course for beginners? And this year I also started this podcast to speak to amazing astrologers like yourself. I mean, all across the world. I mean,
it's amazing.
Right in your face without going in, into too much detail. It's just, this technique fascinates me so much. And especially when you start doing it in your course, layering the Profections, the Lord of the Years, and all these different, synodic cycles, cycles of the planets. It's so fascinating to me. And this course is going to be so amazing.
And what a more public year you're into this year. Everything all above the horizon pretty much. And that 9th house of publicity,
Exactly. Just flicking through them, it was like all below hemisphere, then all up. It was just like stellium. Yeah. But it's amazing how, amazing. So it gets back to the point of the fate versus free will, because, I could have calculated this years ago and it still would have been the same for my natal. So it makes me wonder, when I was in the camp of, not indiscriminate free will, but leaning more towards the element of being able to, chart your own destiny, which you can to a certain degree. But, when I use these techniques, when I look forward, I'm like, wow, am I just a being on this planet filling in the gaps? And these overarching themes are there for me. It's just a fascinating philosophical topic.
Yes. And of course, when you're looking at multiple years, it's too hard. Like, Callum 10 years ago would have not understood what this chart was, but there are other things that we look at. There's a pattern in which the sun moves through and the ascendant goes through. So that's what we look at in, I think, week 3 of the course, where we're looking at multiple years, so that you can get that big lens of like, okay, these are my active years, these are my stable years, etc.
Wonderful, absolutely fantastic. And as, again, this is going to be such a fantastic class, and I've actually got the graphic up here. So your course will be starting on July 23rd. Again, I've added my cup of tea.
Yes.
23rd from 4:15 to 5:45 p.m. and that's Pacific time. So obviously look up the location where you are and what time that will be. And this will be a 5-week course this time, because I think you've taught a 4-week course before. So this can be a 5-week course.
Yes, this will be a 5-week course. So great revision, actually, for those that have done it before. And the difference between the 4-week course that I've taught previously was that this year we're going to be adding in tracking the solar return throughout the year. So that's really handy for when you either have clients that come back and needing an update, or you need an update for yourself.
Wonderful. So you're really fine tuning into, the months or where it is, and it's not just an overarching theme. That's absolutely fascinating. I do apologize if we go back to this video that I might have skipped a few slides when we were talking. So I apologize to everyone. I do need a new cup of tea.
That's fine. You did a great job.
Thank you. So again, for everybody, we'll put pop-ups on the screen in this video. And again, the link to this registration for Shu's fantastic solar returns class is going to be underneath this video. And again, thank you so much, Shu. Your insights are so fascinating and amazing, and we love having you on this show.
Thank you, Callum. It's so great to speak to you, and look forward to seeing you at the course.